Imagine opening your safe tomorrow, looking at everything inside it, and being told by your own government that you have 26 days to hand it over or go to prison for 10 years. Not stolen goods, not contraband, not a weapon, gold. The thing human beings have used as money for 4,000 years. The one asset your grandparents bought precisely because no government could print it, inflate it, or take it away from them. On April 5, 1933, the President of the United States signed a single page of paper that made it a federal crime for an American citizen to own more than $100 in gold. Not to smuggle it, not to counterfeit it, to own it. In your house, in your pocket. In a box you paid rent on every year. The deadline was May 1st. The penalty was $10,000. Roughly $250,000 in today's money. Or 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Or both. And the price they paid you for it was $20.67 an ounce. Remember that number, because 9 months later, the same government that took your gold at $20.67 revalued it at $35 and kept the difference, roughly $2.8 billion in 1933 money. So how does this happen in a country founded on property rights? Who actually came knocking? And did anybody go to prison? What happened to the man who told the federal government no in writing with a lawyer? And why did the president's own budget director tell him, to his face, that this was the end of Western civilization? This is the story of the largest transfer of private wealth to the state in American history, and the active phase of it was over in 26 days. To understand how it was even possible, we have to go back to the 10 weeks before that page was signed, because by the time Roosevelt picked up the pen, America had already run out of money. Start with what the gold standard actually meant, because almost everybody gets this slightly wrong. A dollar in 1932 was not backed by gold in some vague symbolic sense. A dollar was a claim on gold. You could walk into a bank with paper currency and walk out with metal on demand at a fixed legal rate of $20.67 per troy ounce. That was not a marketing promise. That was the law, and that law cut both ways. Because the Federal Reserve was legally required to hold gold reserves against the currency it issued, the government could not print a dollar it did not have the gold to cover. That was the entire point. It was a chain on the printing press, and Americans of that era considered the chain a feature, not a bug. Then came deflation, and the chain became a noose. Between 1929 and 1933, prices in the United States collapsed by roughly a quarter. Now, falling prices sound pleasant until you understand what they do to debt. Deflation means money gets more valuable over time, which means every dollar you owe gets heavier every year, while your income shrinks underneath it. Picture a farmer in Nebraska with a mortgage written in 1928. The mortgage does not shrink. The wheat does. He is now paying a fixed 1928 debt with 1932 wheat that fetches a third of what it used to, and there is nothing he can do about it except lose the farm. Multiply that across a continent. The Federal Reserve, in theory, could have eased this by expanding the money supply. In practice, it was pinned. Every dollar it created required gold behind it, and the gold was running out, because by early 1933, ordinary people had stopped trusting paper entirely. This is the part that gets left out of most tellings. February 1933 was not simply a run on banks. It was a run on gold itself. Depositors were pulling currency out of banks and immediately converting it into metal, because they had begun to suspect the dollar was about to be devalued, which of course made the devaluation more likely, a self-fulfilling panic feeding on its own logic. Michigan closed its banks on February 14th. The panic jumped state lines like fire through dry grass. Maryland, then Ohio, then Kentucky. Governors declared bank holidays one after another to stop the withdrawals, and each closure convinced the next state's depositors to get their money out first. By the first week of March, the banking system of the wealthiest country on earth was, in most of the country, simply switched off. And the New York Federal Reserve's gold reserve was draining by the day. On the morning of March 4th, 1933, a new president was sworn in to lead a nation whose financial system had, for all practical purposes, already ceased to function. He had about 4 days to fix it. Franklin Roosevelt had campaigned in 1932 as a fiscal conservative. He promised a balanced budget. He criticized his opponent for reckless spending. He had given voters no serious reason to believe he intended to touch the currency at all. His attorney general was Homer Cummings, a man who got the job almost by accident after the original nominee died before taking office. And it was Cummings who found the door. On March 6th, 2 days after the inauguration, Roosevelt declared a nationwide bank holiday. Every bank in America closed by proclamation, not by legislation, by proclamation. The legal authority he cited for this was the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. Sit with that for a second. A wartime statute, written to let the government seize the assets of foreign enemies during the First World War, aimed in peacetime at American citizens and American banks. Whether that was a legitimate reading of the law was, at the time, genuinely disputed inside the administration itself, so they fixed the dispute. On March 9th, Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act, introduced, debated, and passed in a single day. Accounts from the period describe members voting on a bill that had barely been printed, with some working from a rough draft read aloud on the floor. It passed the House in a matter of hours. The president signed it that night. The act did two things. It retroactively blessed everything Roosevelt had already done, and it amended the Trading with the Enemy Act so that its powers applied. And here's the phrase that matters more than anything else in this story. During any period of national emergency declared by the president. Any period of national emergency. 6 words. Those 6 words are the legal foundation of everything that follows, and as you'll see at the end of this video, they never really went away. Not everyone in the room was comfortable. Lewis Douglas, Roosevelt's director of the budget, was an orthodox hard-money conservative who had signed on to balance the ledger, not to rewrite the meaning of the dollar. He was about to become the most quotable dissenter in the administration. The banks reopened. The panic stopped almost immediately. Deposits actually flowed back in. And in the space of 9 days, the President of the United States had quietly acquired the legal authority to take gold out of American hands. He waited less than a month to use it. April 5, 1933. Executive Order 6102. The title reads like an accounting memo, forbidding the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States. Look at that word, hoarding. Yesterday, keeping gold coin in a drawer was called saving. It was the single most conservative thing a cautious person could do with money, the behavior every bank, every parent, every newspaper editorial had recommended for a century. On April 5th, it acquired a new name, and the new name sounded like a crime. The administration used that word relentlessly, and the press picked it up and ran with it. Before a single agent knocked on a single door, the language had already done half the work. Here is what the order actually required. Every person in the United States was to deliver all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates in their possession to a Federal Reserve Bank or a member bank on or before May 1, 1933. In exchange, you would be paid $20.67 per troy ounce in paper. There were exemptions, and they matter because this is where the honest version of the story separates from the outraged version. You could keep up to $100 in gold coin and gold certificates per person, about 5 $20 gold pieces. Rare and unusual coin of recognized value to collectors was exempt, and gold used in industry, art, or profession was exempt. Dentists, jewelers, watchmakers, sign painters, anyone who needed the metal to do the work. And the penalty for noncompliance, a fine of up to $10,000, imprisonment of up to 10 years, or both. 2 months later, Congress finished the job. On June 5, 1933, a joint resolution abrogated gold clauses, the standard contract provisions that let a creditor demand repayment in gold rather than paper. Glossed that plainly, overnight, millions of private contracts freely negotiated between consenting parties were rewritten by the federal government. If you had lent money on the explicit promise of being repaid in metal, that promise was now void, and you were getting paper. So the order was signed, the deadline was set, and the penalty was real. Which leaves the question everybody actually clicked on this video to ask. Did anyone actually come to the door? The first thing that happened was compliance. Enormous, orderly, largely voluntary compliance. Lines formed outside Federal Reserve branches. People brought coin collections, watch cases, wedding rings, cigarette cases, gold pieces that had been handed down through 2 generations. Newsreels framed it as patriotic duty, everyone doing their part, the way you'd frame a scrap drive. Banks reported people arriving with their entire family's holdings in a cloth bag. But there was a quieter countercurrent, and bank employees noticed it. In the final days before the deadline, a lot of safe deposit boxes got emptied by people who were not on their way to a teller window. Now, the enforcement. 2 names. The first is Frederick Barber Campbell. He was a New York attorney, and he had roughly 5,000 ounces of gold on deposit at Chase National Bank. That is the kind of holding that belongs to a man with both the money and the temperament to make a federal case out of it. Campbell went to withdraw his gold. The bank refused. So he did the thing almost nobody else in America did. He sued. The government's response was not a negotiation. It was an indictment. And then the case did something nobody in the administration wanted. In examining it, a federal judge found a defect in how the order had been issued, a problem with the chain of authority behind the president's signature. The result was that a follow-up executive order had to be issued that August to patch the hole in the first one. Read that back slowly. The federal government criminally prosecuted a man under a rule that it then had to quietly rewrite because the rule, as written, did not hold up. The second name is Gus Farber. He was a jewelry and coin dealer in San Francisco, and he was prosecuted over transactions involving a modest number of $20 gold pieces. The investigating agency was the Secret Service, worth stating clearly because people assume the FBI. It wasn't. Gold was Treasury's business, and the Secret Service was Treasury's enforcement arm. Contemporary accounts describe related arrests among Bay Area dealers, including Farber's own father, and safe deposit boxes opened under Treasury supervision. So, yes, agents did come. Boxes were opened. People were arrested and charged. And this is also where the most durable financial legend in America comes from, the story that every safe deposit box in the country was drilled open and inventoried. Here is the seed of truth underneath it. During the bank holiday in March, every safe deposit box in America genuinely was inaccessible because every bank in America was shut. Millions of people walked up to locked doors and could not reach their own property. That happened. That is real. What people remembered decades later was the feeling of it, and the feeling grew into something bigger than the fact. A handful of prosecutions, a small number of sealed boxes, and a country that overwhelmingly complied anyway, which raises a far more uncomfortable question than the one you came here with. If the raids were that rare, why did everyone hand it over? I have to stop here and be straight with you about something, because the version of this story that circulates online is not quite the version that happened, and the real one is stranger. There was no nationwide house-to-house sweep. There was no general drilling of every vault in America. There was no wave of citizens going to prison for keeping gold coins in a sock drawer. The prosecutions were rare, and they were aimed overwhelmingly at dealers, at large holders, and at people who made a public point of refusing. But here is what is true, and it is more interesting than the myth. The threat was universal. It did not need to be executed to work. Every American read the same headline, the same $10,000 fine, the same 10 years. The government did not need agents on every porch. It needed the possibility of an agent on every porch plus a word-eye hoarding that made your neighbors look at you differently. And it is also true that the operation was not remotely complete. By most historical estimates, a very substantial share of privately held gold coin was never surrendered at all. It went into mattresses and floorboards. It went abroad, and a great deal of it was quietly reclassified as rare and unusual coin of recognized value to collectors, an exemption that turned out to be as elastic as the people using it needed it to be. So the confiscation was less a raid than a bluff, and the bluff worked on almost everybody. If you think about the power that implies the ability to move a nation's private savings with a proclamation and a word, that's arguably more unsettling than the raid would have been. But none of that is what made people genuinely, permanently angry. The anger came 9 months later, because the government was not finished with the price. Enter George Warren. He was an agricultural economist at Cornell, not a monetary economist, an agricultural one, and he had a theory that Roosevelt found irresistible. If the government raised the dollar price of gold, the dollar price of everything else would rise with it, and the deflation strangling the country would break. So, through the autumn of 1933, the President of the United States personally set the government's gold buying price. Not a committee, not the Federal Reserve. Him, often in morning meetings held in his bedroom, over breakfast with Treasury officials standing around the bed. And there is a detail from those mornings, recorded by his own Treasury Secretary, that I want you to hear without any editorializing from me. On one occasion, deciding how much to raise the price that day, Roosevelt chose an increase of 21 cents. His stated reason was that 21 is 3 times 7 3, and 7 was a lucky number. That is the mechanism by which the value of every dollar held by every American was being adjusted. Then it became permanent. On January 30th, 1934, the Gold Reserve Act transferred title of the nation's monetary gold to the Treasury. The next day, January 31st, the price was fixed by proclamation at $35 an ounce. Now do the arithmetic, slowly. 9 months earlier, Americans had been legally compelled to surrender their gold at $20.67 an ounce. That same gold was now, by the government's own declaration, worth $35. The dollar had been devalued by roughly 40% against gold. The paper profit on the Treasury's newly acquired hoard came to approximately $2.8 billion. Real money in an era when the entire federal budget was a few billion dollars, and it was credited to a newly created government fund. Every cent of that gain existed because the people who had owned the gold were legally prohibited from still owning it when the price changed. That is the whole story in one sentence. The taking and the revaluation were separated by 9 months, which was just long enough for the sequence to look like two unrelated policies instead of one transaction. Lewis Douglas, the budget director, watched the country leave the gold standard and reportedly said, "This is the end of Western civilization." He resigned the following year. Depending on who you asked, this was either the most effective monetary maneuver of the 20th century or the largest legalized taking in American history. In 1935, 9 people in black robes were asked to decide which. They were called the Gold Clause cases, and they reached the Supreme Court in February 1935. The plaintiffs were bondholders and creditors, and their argument was simple. Congress cannot pass a law erasing a promise that was already made. A contract that said payable in gold meant payable in gold. The stakes were almost incomprehensible. If the court ruled the other way, every gold clause debt in the United States, private mortgages, corporate bonds, and the federal government's own borrowing would have repriced overnight against a dollar that had just lost a large chunk of its value. The estimates of the potential liability ran into tens of billions. The Attorney General's office believed an adverse ruling could produce chaos worse than 1933. The decisions came down 5-4. For private contracts, the abrogation stood. Congress had the power over the currency, and that power reached into contracts written in it. But in the case concerning the government's own bonds, the court said something remarkable. It held that Congress repudiating its own explicit promise to pay in gold was beyond its constitutional power. The government had, in the court's judgment, broken a promise it had no right to break, and then it awarded the plaintiff nothing. Because in a country where holding gold was now illegal, the court reasoned, he could not demonstrate any actual loss. He could not have kept the gold anyway. So the United States government was told, in a Supreme Court opinion, that it had acted beyond its authority, and it kept the money. There is a final detail here that almost nobody knows. Roosevelt had prepared a radio address to deliver in the event that the ruling went against him. The surviving draft makes clear he intended to act regardless of what the court decided. He never had to give it. A single vote is the difference between the history you just heard and a constitutional crisis. The order held. The dollar stayed devalued, and a measure sold to the American public as an emergency response to a banking panic stayed on the books for 41 years. Now let me argue the other side properly, because I think you deserve the strongest version of it rather than a straw man. Deflation was killing the United States. That is not a matter of interpretation. Prices had fallen roughly a quarter, debts had not, and the Federal Reserve was legally incapable of doing anything about it, because every dollar it might have created required gold reserves it did not have and could not get. The gold standard in that specific moment was not protecting American savers. It was strangling American borrowers, the farmers, the small manufacturers, the mortgage holders, and it was doing it automatically, with no one at the wheel. And the results are hard to wave away. Prices stopped falling in 1933, industrial output turned upward, and economists looking at the 1930s across many countries have repeatedly found the same pattern. The nations that left gold earliest tended to recover earliest, and the ones that clung to it longest suffered longest. By that measure, breaking the gold link may well have been the single most effective act of the early New Deal, more consequential than any of the programs people actually remember. I think that case is strong. I also think it doesn't settle anything, because effectiveness is not the same thing as legitimacy. The policy worked by design on the people who had done exactly what they had been told for a century was the prudent thing to do: save in the hardest asset available. It took their property at a price the government set by threat of imprisonment and then changed the price. Whatever else that is, it is a state deciding that private savings were a policy instrument. Both of those things are true at the same time. That is not a contradiction I can resolve for you. It is the actual shape of the story, and anyone selling you a version where only one half is true is selling you something. But there's a coda to all this, and it involves a single coin that should not exist. In 1933, the U.S. Mint struck double eagles, $20 gold pieces, as it had every year. Then the order came down, gold coinage ended, and the entire run was sent to be melted. Officially, none was ever released into circulation. A small number got out anyway. What followed was decades of legal warfare over who owned them, involving the Secret Service, private collectors, and repeated seizures. One specimen, the only one the government ever legally cleared for private ownership, went to auction in 2021. It sold for $18.9 million, a coin with a face value of $20. Struck in the year the government made gold illegal, ordered destroyed and surviving anyway. Sold for $18.9 million, while the Americans who obeyed the law and turned in theirs were paid $20.67 an ounce. Private gold ownership became legal again in the United States on December 31, 1974.